I need to tell you something that happened to me 7 days ago. It's a story that will sound absolutely impossible, but I swear on everything I hold sacred, every single word is true. I was in my hotel room in Atlanta at 4 a.m., curled up on the cold tile of the bathroom floor. I was in the throes of the worst panic attack of my adult life, a storm of fear and self-loathing that felt like it would tear my soul apart. It was in that moment of absolute desolation that Jesus appeared beside me. He didn't just comfort me. He revealed the shocking, fundamental truth about why we feel worthless, even when we intellectually know we are loved by God. What he showed me in that bathroom didn't just heal my shame, it completely and utterly destroyed every lie I had ever believed about my value. He gave me the keys, the very blueprint, to help others break free from the poison of worthlessness that has been silently corrupting their souls for years. But before I begin, before I take you into that sacred, terrifying, and ultimately beautiful moment, I'd love to know that I'm not just speaking into a void. Please let me know in the comments where you are listening from and what time it is where you are. I just want to feel that I'm not alone in this digital space, sharing the most vulnerable moment of my life. And if what you hear resonates with you, if it touches a place in your heart that has been aching for this truth, please consider subscribing. It doesn't just help a channel, it gives me the strength and courage to continue speaking my truth, no matter how difficult it may be. Now let's go back. I'm recording this from a different hotel room, this time in Los Angeles. I flew here just after what was, without a shadow of a doubt, the most spiritually transformative week of my entire life. It's 3:15 a.m., and by all rights, I should be completely exhausted. The emotional whiplash of the past 7 days should have left me drained, but I cannot sleep. My mind is electric, my spirit is soaring, because what Jesus revealed to me about the nature of worthlessness and shame has completely revolutionized how I see myself, my value, and the insidious lies that had been methodically, quietly destroying my peace for decades. To understand the miracle, you must first understand the crisis that brought me to my breaking point. We had just finished filming some of the most emotionally demanding scenes of The Chosen's final season. These were the moments where Jesus faces the raw, brutal reality of rejection, betrayal, and abandonment by the very people he came to save. As an actor, portraying these scenes required me to pour every ounce of my emotional and spiritual energy into them. I had to go to places of deep pain and isolation. But as a person, as Jonathan, these scenes triggered something dormant within me, a deep-seated vulnerability I was utterly unprepared to handle. For weeks leading up to this, I had been making a critical mistake. I was reading the online comments about my portrayal of Jesus, and while the vast majority were incredibly encouraging and life-giving, a vocal, persistent minority was absolutely brutal in their criticism. The words were like 1,000 tiny paper cuts on my soul. He's too emotional. He doesn't look like Jesus. His accent is all wrong. He's not spiritual enough. He seems too human. He's ruining the show for me. They should never have cast him. At first, I tried to rationalize it, to build a fortress of logic around my heart. This is the inevitable cost of playing such a monumental role, I told myself. You can't possibly please everyone, especially when you're portraying the single most important figure in all of human history. Everyone has a preconceived image of Jesus in their mind and heart. But logic is a poor defense against the insidious whispers of shame. Gradually, those venomous voices began to echo louder in the chambers of my mind than the thousands of positive, loving responses we received every single day. The negative voices had a weight, a gravity that the positive ones seemed to lack. The breaking point, the straw that finally shattered the camel's back, came during a fan meet and greet in Atlanta. The energy in the room was electric, filled with people who had been profoundly blessed by the show. I was signing autographs, taking pictures, and hearing incredible stories of healing and renewed faith. Then, a woman approached my table with her teenage daughter. They both seemed genuinely excited to meet me. But as I was signing their poster, the mother said something that, in its casual innocence, completely shattered my fragile emotional equilibrium. You know, she said, with a tone of what seemed like guileless honesty, my daughter and I were just discussing how different you look from how we always pictured Jesus. We've gotten used to it now, of course, but it was really jarring at first. We honestly thought they might have made a mistake in casting. I know she didn't mean it maliciously. In her mind, it was probably just a piece of casual conversation, maybe even a backhanded compliment about how my acting had managed to win them over despite my not fitting their physical expectations. But in that moment, With my confidence already eroded by weeks of relentless online criticism, her words felt like the final, damning confirmation of my deepest, darkest fear, that I was fundamentally wrong for this role. That millions of people felt a pang of disappointment every time they saw my face on screen. That instead of enhancing their connection to Jesus, I was somehow diminishing it. I was an obstacle to be gotten used to. I somehow managed to finish the meet and greet with a smile plastered on my face, but inside I was crumbling into dust. That night, back in the suffocating quiet of my Atlanta hotel room, I made the fatal error of diving headfirst into the digital abyss. I sought out the darkest corners of online forums and social media threads dedicated to the show. For 3 solid hours, I scrolled through an endless river of commentary dissecting my inadequacies as Jesus. He's too short. His facial features are all wrong. He lacks the necessary gravitas. Jesus should be more commanding, more regal. He makes Jesus seem weak and fragile. I just can't connect with this version of Christ. They should have cast someone else. By 2 a.m., I wasn't just reading criticism. I was drowning in it. I was caught in a full-blown shame spiral that felt like it was going to physically annihilate my soul. This was no longer about a critique of my acting. It had metastasized into a judgment on my very existence. If I, Jonathan, couldn't even adequately represent the person I had dedicated my entire life to following, then what was my value? If people looked at Jesus, the source of all hope and love, and felt disappointed because they were seeing me, what did that say about who I was as a person? The rational part of my mind, the small, sane voice in the corner, knew this was catastrophic thinking. It knew that criticism is part and parcel of any public role. It knew it's impossible to meet every single person's expectations. It knew that my ultimate worth wasn't determined by the fickle court of public opinion. But the raw, bleeding, emotional part of my soul was utterly convinced that every negative comment was irrefutable evidence of a fundamental, unfixable inadequacy. That's when the panic attack hit. It was a physical assault. Suddenly, I couldn't breathe. My chest felt like it was being crushed by a concrete slab, the weight of every criticism I had ever received in my entire life, not just about my portrayal of Jesus, but about my acting, my appearance, my personality, my faith, my entire existence. I stumbled from the bed, tripping over my own feet, and collapsed onto the cold tile floor of the bathroom, gasping for air that wouldn't come. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. Lying there on that hotel bathroom floor, shaking uncontrollably and hyperventilating, I felt more worthless than I had ever felt in my life. It was a worthlessness so profound it felt like a law of physics. I wasn't just an inadequate actor. I was a fundamentally flawed human being. A mistake. If my best efforts, my most sincere and prayerful attempts to represent Christ, were causing people to stumble rather than be blessed, then maybe I really was the casting mistake everyone seemed to think I was. The shame was an overwhelming, suffocating blanket. It wasn't just shame about my performance, but shame about my sensitivity to the criticism. Shame about my inability to handle negative feedback like a mature, well-adjusted adult. Shame about my desperate, pathetic need for approval from total strangers. Shame about my failure to find my security in God's unchanging opinion rather than the shifting sands of human opinions. I felt ashamed of feeling ashamed, creating a vicious, self-devouring cycle that made everything exponentially worse. And that's when I did something I'd never done before, not in this way. Instead of just pleading with God to make the pain stop, to help me feel better, I began to question him directly, demanding to understand why I felt so fundamentally worthless despite intellectually knowing I was loved. God, I said aloud, my voice a ragged, echoing whisper against the tiles, I need you to help me understand something. I know you love me. I know my worth doesn't come from other people's opinions. I know all the right theological answers about identity and value, but I feel worthless anyway. I feel like a mistake, like everyone can see some fundamental, hideous flaw in me that I can't fix. Why? The bathroom was utterly silent, save for the sound of my own ragged breathing and the distant, muffled hum of Atlanta traffic through the sealed hotel window. I felt like I was sitting at the brutal intersection of theological knowledge and emotional reality, knowing the truth in my head but completely unable to feel it in my heart. I've spent 6 years of my life playing your son, I continued, my voice finally breaking with the full weight of my exhaustion and desperation. I've spoken your words about love and forgiveness and acceptance to millions of people. But right now, I feel like the biggest fraud in the history of Christian entertainment. How can I represent someone who brings life when I feel like I'm dying inside? How can I portray unconditional love and acceptance when I feel so fundamentally, deeply unacceptable? The silence that followed was different. It wasn't an empty quiet. It felt pregnant with possibility, like the hushed moment just before dawn when the darkness is about to give way to the light. I had moved beyond asking for help. I was questioning the very foundation of my understanding of worth and shame. "If you really love me," I whispered, finally giving voice to the serpent-like doubt that had been eating away at my soul, "then why do I feel so worthless? Why does criticism hurt this much? If my value truly comes from you, why can't I just believe what I know is true about your love? What is wrong with me that I need human approval so desperately?" What I didn't know was that my raw, honest questions about worthlessness and shame were about to be answered in the most profound and unimaginable way. Because at exactly 4:17 a.m., the very atmosphere in that sterile hotel bathroom began to shift, to vibrate in a way that would heal wounds I didn't even know were bleeding, and give me the keys to help others break free from the shame that destroys souls while masquerading as humility. The revelation. The air became thick, yet breathable. It felt more alive, charged with a presence so saturated with love and pure understanding that my panic attacks ceased instantly. My heart rate slowed, my breathing deepened. The temperature in the room didn't change, but reality itself felt more intense, more vibrant, as if the veil between worlds had thinned. I knew, with a certainty that transcended logic, that I was about to receive something that would transform not just my understanding, but my entire relationship with my own value. And then, sitting on the edge of the bathtub as naturally and calmly as if he had been there all along, was Jesus. It wasn't the way I portray him in the show, with the specific costumes and scripted lines. This was unmistakably, overwhelmingly him. His presence filled that tiny, sterile bathroom with such an immense, unconditional acceptance that my shame began to dissolve like salt in water before he even spoke a word. He was looking at me not with disappointment or pity, but with the most compassionate eyes I had ever seen. Eyes full of profound understanding for a soul who had finally reached the point of honest desperation about its deepest pain. "Jonathan," he said, and his voice carried both the undeniable authority of absolute truth and the profound tenderness of someone who understood the sting of shame from the inside out. "Thank you for finally asking the real questions. For years, you've been trying to fix your feelings about your worth. You've tried to argue with them, to ignore them, to outperform them. But you've never asked me to show you where those feelings actually come from. Now, I can heal what's really been hurting you." I could barely speak, my throat tight with a mixture of awe, relief, and exhaustion. I managed to whisper, "Jesus, why? Why do I feel so worthless when I know you love me? Why does criticism feel like it's revealing some fundamental, ugly flaw in who I am?" His expression held such perfect, knowing empathy. It was as if he had personally experienced this exact pain. "Because, my beloved son," he began, "you have been carrying a shame that was never yours to carry. You have been trying to heal from wounds you didn't even know you had. And you have been believing lies about your value that were planted so early in your life that they feel like absolute truth." Jesus leaned forward slightly, and I felt overwhelmed by the sheer force of love radiating from his presence. "The worthlessness you feel isn't about your acting, your appearance, or your adequacy to play me. It's about something much deeper, something that happened long before you ever stepped in front of a camera. And once you understand where shame really comes from, you will be free from it forever." He settled back on the edge of the bathtub, a master teacher preparing to give the most important lesson. I knew in that moment that I was about to receive the most profound education about human worth I would ever get. "Are you ready?" he asked gently, "to learn why you feel worthless despite being infinitely valuable? Because once you understand this, everything changes. Your relationship with criticism, your desperate need for approval, your paralyzing fear of disappointing people, all of it transforms when you discover what worthlessness really is and why it has absolutely nothing to do with who you actually are." I nodded, feeling more ready to receive truth than I had ever felt in my entire life. The shame that had been crushing my spirit was still a lingering shadow, but his presence made it feel like a disease that could be cured rather than a terminal diagnosis I would have to carry forever. "Then let me show you," he said, his voice filled with the promise of imminent freedom, the truth about shame that will set you free from worthlessness forever. Because what you are about to learn isn't just for you, Jonathan. It is for everyone who has ever felt fundamentally flawed. It is for everyone who starves for human approval to feel valuable. It is for every soul that believes the lies about their worth that shame whispers in the darkness. Jesus settled on the edge of that hotel bathtub, and his presence transformed my cramped, sterile bathroom into what felt like the most sacred healing sanctuary in history. The shame that had been crushing my soul for hours began to lift, to lose its power, as I realized I was about to finally understand something I'd been struggling with my entire life without even knowing it. The first thing you need to understand about worthlessness, he began, his voice filled with the kind of gentle authority that comes from seeing the whole tapestry, when we can only see a few tangled threads, is that it's not actually about your value, it's about your perception of your value. You feel worthless not because you are worthless, but because you have been programmed from a very young age to see yourself through the distorted lens of shame, rather than the clear lens of love. I felt a profound shift in my understanding. It was like a key turning in a lock I never knew existed. He continued, when you were a child, you learned to measure your worth by other people's responses to you. If your parents were pleased, you felt valuable. If your teacher was disappointed, you felt worthless. That is not truth. That is trauma. And trauma creates false beliefs about reality that feel more real than reality itself. The accuracy of this statement hit me like a physical blow. I could trace this exact pattern back to my earliest memories. The desperate, all-consuming need for my father's approval, the crushing devastation I felt when I disappointed a coach, the way any form of criticism felt like it was revealing some fundamental flaw in my character, rather than simply offering feedback on my performance. The second truth about worthlessness, Jesus said, his gaze penetrating and kind, is that it is always rooted in early messages of conditional love. Somewhere in your childhood, you learned that love, acceptance, and safety were based on your performance rather than your existence. That created a core wound, a worthiness wound, that shame has been feeding on for decades. I thought about my upbringing, about family dynamics where love often felt tied to achievement, about early school experiences where my value seemed to fluctuate based on how well I met expectations or pleased authority figures. It wasn't because my family didn't love me. It was because they too had their own wounded ways of expressing love, passed down through generations. When a child learns that love is conditional, he explained, they develop a deep, abiding fear that they are fundamentally unacceptable and must therefore earn the right to be loved. That wound creates a lifelong pattern of seeking validation from others to feel secure in their own existence. It is the root of all people-pleasing. This was already more insight than I had gained from years of trying to overcome my sensitivity to criticism through sheer willpower and positive thinking. My constant need for approval wasn't a character flaw, it was a trauma response. The third truth about worthlessness is that it is maintained by what I call shame-based thinking. He said, instead of seeing criticism as information about your performance, you interpret it as a revelation about your character. Instead of hearing, this could be better, you hear, you are not enough. I realized with a sickening clarity that this was exactly what had happened with the criticism about my portrayal of Jesus. Instead of receiving it as feedback about my acting choices, I had internalized it as definitive evidence of my fundamental inadequacy as a person. When someone says, you don't look like their image of Jesus, he continued with such gentleness that I felt my defensive walls beginning to crumble. Shame translates that into, you are not worthy to represent me. When someone critiques your performance, shame tells you, you are a disappointment to God. That is not truth. That is trauma interpretation. The fourth truth goes even deeper. Worthlessness is always about the past, never about the present. When you feel that surge of worthlessness, you are not responding to what is actually happening now. You are reliving old, unhealed wounds. The criticism you received this week did not create this pain. It simply triggered the immense pain from experiences that happened decades ago. This was revolutionary. I wasn't just being too sensitive to current criticism. I was carrying the unhealed hurt from every single time I had felt rejected, inadequate, or disappointing throughout my entire life. Each new negative comment was like salt being poured into old, festering wounds, making the pain feel far more devastating than it actually was. The fifth truth about worthlessness, Jesus said, standing up and walking to the small mirror above the sink, is that it creates a false identity based on other people's opinions rather than my truth about who you are. You have been trying to establish your worth through human approval instead of simply receiving it through divine love. He turned back to face me, and his eyes were filled with such an overwhelming love that I felt tears begin to well up. Jonathan, your worth was established before the foundations of the world were laid. It does not fluctuate based on your performance. It does not increase when people praise you or decrease when they criticize you. Your value is inherent, permanent, and completely independent of human opinion. The sixth truth is perhaps the most liberating. Worthlessness is a lie that shame tells you to keep you trapped in cycles of people, pleasing, and performance. If you truly deeply knew your worth, you wouldn't need human validation to feel secure. Shame knows this, so it works constantly to convince you that your value is conditional, fragile, and always uncertain. I could see the machinery of this lie operating in my life for years. The desperate need for positive reviews, the crushing devastation from negative feedback, the way my entire emotional state could be determined by whether strangers on the internet approved of my work or not. It wasn't spiritual immaturity, it was shame-based programming. The seventh truth about worthlessness is that it is often disguised as humility or spiritual sensitivity. You have been told, and have told yourself, that needing approval is a weakness, that being hurt by criticism is immaturity, that struggling with shame is a lack of faith. But that is just more shame wrapped in spiritual language. This hit me hard. I had been ashamed of being ashamed, thinking my sensitivity to criticism was evidence of a spiritual failure rather than evidence of unhealed wounds that needed compassion and gentle healing. True humility, Jesus explained, is knowing both your limitations and your infinite value. False humility denies your worth in the name of being spiritual. I did not create you to feel worthless. I created you to know you are infinitely valuable while remaining beautifully dependent on my love to sustain that knowledge. The eighth truth is practical and transformative. Worthlessness can only be healed by receiving love, not by earning approval. You have been trying to fix your shame by getting better reviews, more positive feedback, universal acceptance. But shame cannot be healed by performance. It can only be healed by presence. Jesus returned to sit beside me on the bathroom floor, and I felt overwhelmed by the healing power of simply being seen and accepted, exactly as I was, in my most vulnerable and broken state. Every time you seek human approval to feel valuable, he said gently, you are actually reinforcing the lie that your worth is conditional. But every time you pause and consciously receive my unconditional love, regardless of your performance, you are strengthening the truth that your value is inherent and unchangeable. The ninth truth goes to the very heart of transformation. Healing worthlessness requires grieving the childhood you needed but didn't get. You needed to learn from the very beginning that you were valuable simply for existing. But instead, like so many others, you learned that love was something to be earned. That is a real, legitimate loss, and it deserves to be mourned. For the very first time, I felt permission to grieve the fact that I had never learned to feel inherently valuable, that I had spent decades of my life trying to earn what should have been freely given, that my early childhood experiences had inadvertently set me up for a lifetime of seeking worth in all the wrong places. The grief isn't about blaming your parents or your childhood caregivers, Jesus clarified with immense compassion. They did the best they could with their own wounds and limitations. The grief is about acknowledging that you deserve to know your worth from the very beginning, and you are allowed to be sad that you had to learn it the hard way. And the 10th and final truth, he said, is the key that unlocks everything else. Worthlessness is healed when you understand that you are not trying to become valuable. You are learning to recognize the value you have always possessed. You are not earning worth through your performance. You are discovering worth through your relationship with me. Jesus reached out and gently touched the center of my chest, and in that instant, I felt what he felt when he looked at me. It wasn't disappointment or criticism or a demand for improvement. It was an overwhelming, uncontainable delight in my mere existence. It was profound joy in who I was, exactly as I was, flaws and all. It was an absolute, unshakable conviction that I was worth everything he had given to save me. Jonathan, he said, with such tenderness that I started crying again, but these were different tears, tears of cathartic relief, not of shame. You are not a mistake. You are not inadequate. You are not a disappointment. You are my beloved son, in whom I am well pleased. not because of how well you portray me, but because of how completely I love you. The bathroom fell silent as this profound truth began to penetrate decades of shame-based programming. I wasn't just hearing words. I was experiencing the living reality of an unconditional love that had always been there, but had been blocked by my own wounded perception. But what about the criticism? I asked, my mind still struggling to reconcile this profound truth with the very real pain of negative feedback. What about the people who genuinely think I'm wrong for this role? What about my sensitivity to their opinions? Jesus smiled with the warmth of a patient teacher about to give the most practical wisdom of my life. Criticism will always exist, Jonathan, but it doesn't have to devastate you when you know your worth isn't determined by human opinion. When you are secure in my love, criticism becomes information rather than ammunition for shame. He gestured around the bathroom where I had collapsed in a heap of worthlessness just hours earlier. The people who criticize your portrayal of me aren't attacking your worth. They are expressing their preferences, their expectations, their own wounded ways of relating to disappointment. Their opinions about your performance have absolutely nothing to do with your value as a person. As his form began to fade slightly, signaling that our conversation was nearing its end, he left me with the most transformative truth of all. You will know you are healed from worthlessness when criticism can't crush you and praise can't control you, when your sense of value remains steady and constant, regardless of human opinion, when you can receive feedback without interpreting it as a judgment on your fundamental worth. His final words came with the authority of absolute eternal truth. Remember this encounter, Jonathan. There are millions of people trapped in the prison of shame-based worthlessness, believing they have to earn a love that is already theirs, seeking an approval that will never heal the wounds only I can heal. They need to know that their worth was established before they were born and cannot be diminished by human opinion. As his presence began to fade completely from that hotel bathroom, I felt like someone who had been carrying a crushing, invisible weight for decades and had finally, mercifully, been allowed to set it down. The shame that had been suffocating my soul was completely gone, replaced by a profound, unshakable sense of peace and clarity about my actual worth versus my perceived worth. "Thank you," I whispered to the empty room as his form became translucent on the edge of the bathtub. "Thank you for showing me that worthlessness isn't about my value, it's about my perception of my value." His final words seemed to echo in my spirit with the gentle authority of absolute love. Remember this healing, Jonathan. Every person who sees you living free from shame will want to know how that freedom is possible. Your transformation will become their invitation to discover their own worth. And then he was gone. I was alone again in that bathroom, but I was a completely different man. I was left with the most liberating understanding of human value I had ever received. But this wasn't just an emotional high. It was a profound truth that demanded to be lived out in every area of my life. The aftermath and integration. The first thing I did was something I would have never thought to do before. Instead of just trying to feel better about the criticism, I began to grieve. I grieved the childhood wound that had made criticism feel like a direct assault on my fundamental worth. For a full hour, I sat on that bathroom floor and allowed myself to feel a deep, profound sadness for the little boy who had learned to measure his value by other people's responses to him. I mourned the decades I had spent seeking approval to feel secure in my own existence. I acknowledged the pain of being programmed to interpret feedback as a judgment on my character rather than information about my performance. This wasn't an act of self-pity. It was a sacred, necessary grieving that honored the real loss I had experienced and created the space for authentic, deep healing to finally begin. The next morning, I did something that would have been utterly impossible just 24 hours earlier. With a steady hand, I opened my laptop and read through those same criticism threads again. But this time, I saw them through a completely different lens. Instead of seeing them as verdicts on my inadequacy, I saw them as expressions of disappointed expectations, personal preferences, and sometimes people's own wounded ways of dealing with unmet hopes. He doesn't look like my image of Jesus became. This person had a specific personal expectation that wasn't met. He's too emotional became. This viewer prefers a more stoic interpretation of Jesus's character. He lacks gravitas became. This person associates authority with a different type of physical presence. The words of criticism hadn't changed. but my perception of what they meant about my worth had been completely and radically transformed. These weren't damning verdicts about my value as a person, they were simply human opinions about artistic choices. But the real test came 2 days later when I had to return to the set of The Chosen. Walking into the makeup and wardrobe trailer, I felt a flicker of nervousness. How might this profound encounter change my ability to portray Jesus? What if understanding my worth differently somehow made my performance less relatable or authentic? The exact opposite happened. For the first time in months, I felt completely and utterly free to disappear into the character without the crushing weight of trying to prove my worthiness for the role. Instead of carrying the impossible burden of representing Jesus perfectly to avoid disappointing people, I could simply serve the story with all my skill and trust that God would use my imperfect efforts however He saw fit. Elizabeth Tabish, who plays Mary Magdalene, noticed the difference immediately. "Something's different about your energy today, Jonathan," she observed, as we prepared for a scene where Jesus comforts the disciples after a particularly difficult teaching moment. "You seem more settled, more present, like you're not carrying some invisible anxiety." I shared with her what had happened in Atlanta, the panic attack, the encounter with Jesus, the profound healing from shame-based worthlessness. Her response was one of immediate, deep recognition. "I have struggled with feeling fundamentally flawed my entire life," she confessed, her voice soft. "Always feeling like I have to prove I deserve to be in any room I'm in." "What you're describing about trauma interpretation, that's exactly what happens to me. I hear feedback about my work as a judgment about my character." George Xanthus, who plays John, overheard our conversation and joined in with his own vulnerability. "That need for approval has controlled me for years," he admitted. "I can't just do good work and feel satisfied. I need everyone to love it, or I feel like I've failed as a person. It's utterly exhausting." Later that day, Dallas Jenkins, our creator and director, approached me during a lunch break with an observation that confirmed the transformation was real and visible. "Jonathan, whatever happened to you in Atlanta, it's showing up in your performance. You're portraying Jesus with a freedom and a confidence that feels completely natural and grounded. It's like you finally understand His security in the Father's love from the inside out." That afternoon, we filmed one of the most challenging scenes of the entire series, Jesus facing harsh, relentless criticism from religious leaders who publicly question His authority and mock His claims about being the Son of God. In the past, scenes like this would have invariably triggered my own sensitivity to criticism, making it a struggle to portray Jesus' unshakable security in His identity. But this time, I could access Jesus' profound peace in the face of harsh judgment because I finally, truly understood what it felt like to know your worth isn't determined by human opinion. The security wasn't something I had to perform, it was something I could actually feel. "That is the most authentic portrayal of Jesus under attack I have ever seen," our director said after we wrapped the scene. "It didn't look like acting. It looked like someone who genuinely understands what it means to be secure in divine love while facing human rejection." Over the following weeks, word spread quietly among the cast and crew about my experience. Not because I was broadcasting it, but because the transformation was so evident that people kept asking what had changed. I began having quiet, meaningful conversations with cast members, crew, and eventually fans about the crucial difference between worth and worthiness, between inherent value and earned approval, between trauma interpretation and truth-based perception. A month after my encounter, I received an invitation that would have terrified me before my healing. A major Christian podcast wanted to interview me specifically about dealing with criticism and maintaining a strong identity in public ministry. In the past, this would have activated every insecurity I had. That I wasn't qualified to give advice. That I wasn't spiritual enough to help others. That I hadn't figured everything out myself. Instead, I felt a calm excitement to share what I had learned, not as an expert who had never struggled, but as a fellow traveler who had found a path to freedom from the struggle. "Jonathan," said the podcast host during our recording, "you're talking about shame and worthlessness with such incredible clarity and freedom. Have you always understood these concepts so well?" "Absolutely not," I replied with complete honesty. 7 weeks ago, I was curled up on a hotel bathroom floor, having a full-blown panic attack because negative comments online had convinced me I was fundamentally inadequate. I am sharing this from a place of fresh healing, not lifelong wisdom. That vulnerability seemed to create an immediate and powerful connection with the audience. The podcast received more responses than any episode they had done that year, with hundreds of people writing in to share their own lifelong struggles with shame-based worthlessness and asking for more resources about healing trauma interpretation. 3 months after my encounter with Jesus, I received a message that demonstrated the beautiful, powerful ripple effect of transformation. A young actor who had listened to the podcast reached out to share that my story had saved his life. I was planning to end my career and maybe my life, he wrote, because I felt so fundamentally worthless after a series of rejections and bad reviews. Your explanation of trauma interpretation was like a lightning bolt. It helped me realize I wasn't just responding to current criticism. I was reliving every time I'd felt rejected since I was a child. I'm getting therapy now and learning to grieve the wounds that made criticism feel like a direct attack on my worth. Thank you. This was multiplication in action. My healing had become his invitation to healing, which would undoubtedly become someone else's invitation to freedom. Now, almost a year after that life-altering night in Atlanta, the transformation is evident in every area of my life. My relationship with social media is completely different. I can read comments without my emotional state being determined by the ratio of positive to negative feedback. My approach to my work is more sustainable and joyful. I can pursue excellence without needing perfection to feel valuable. My connections with friends and family are deeper because I am no longer constantly, subconsciously seeking their validation to feel secure in their love. But the most profound change was revealed in my work on the final season of portraying Jesus. Every scene where he demonstrated unshakable security in the Father's love, every moment where he remained peaceful despite harsh criticism, every interaction where he loved people without needing their approval in return, all of it flowed from a place of authentic, personal understanding rather than performed spirituality. There's something different about how you're playing Jesus in these final episodes, our cinematographer observed one day. It's like you understand his divine confidence from personal experience, rather than just trying to portray it externally. The healing had made my portrayal more authentic, not less. Understanding my own worth had given me access to Jesus' security in a way I had never been able to reach through acting technique alone. An invitation to freedom. Maybe as you're listening to this, you recognize yourself in my story. Maybe you have your own acute sensitivity to criticism that feels wildly out of proportion to the actual feedback you're receiving. Maybe you struggle with a relentless need for approval from others to feel valuable, secure, or acceptable. Maybe you are someone who consistently interprets neutral feedback as a personal attack, who hears this could be better as you're not enough. Maybe you carry a deep shame about being so sensitive to criticism, instead of understanding that this sensitivity often comes from unhealed childhood wounds. Maybe you're trapped in the exhausting cycles of people-pleasing, performance-based worth, or the fruitless pursuit of universal approval that never actually delivers the security it promises. I want you to hear me clearly. The worthlessness you feel is not evidence of your actual value. It is evidence of a wounded perception that can be healed. You are not fundamentally flawed. You are not too sensitive. And you are not spiritually immature. You are likely carrying years of trauma interpretation that makes current criticism feel like childhood rejection. The 10 truths Jesus taught me about worthlessness have the power to transform any shame-based perception of your value. Let them sink into your soul. Worthlessness is about your perception of value, not your actual value. You feel worthless not because you are worthless, but because you've been programmed to see yourself through the lens of shame rather than love. Worthlessness is rooted in early messages about conditional love. You learned that acceptance was based on performance rather than your mere existence, creating a core wound that shame has been feeding on ever since. Worthlessness is maintained by trauma interpretation that hears criticism as character judgment rather than performance feedback. Shame translates this could be better into, you are not enough. Worthlessness is about the past, not the present. When you feel worthless, you are reliving old, unhealed wounds, not responding to what's actually happening now. Worthlessness creates a false identity based on human opinion rather than divine truth. You've been trying to establish your worth through approval instead of receiving it through love. Worthlessness is a lie that shame tells to keep you trapped in people-pleasing cycles. If you knew your true worth, you wouldn't need constant validation to feel secure. Worthlessness is often disguised as humility or sensitivity. True humility knows both your limitations and your infinite value. False humility denies your worth in the name of being spiritual. Worthlessness can only be healed by receiving love, not by earning approval. Shame cannot be fixed by performance. It can only be healed by presence. Healing worthlessness requires grieving the childhood you needed but didn't get. You deserve to know your value from the beginning, and you're allowed to be sad that you had to learn it the hard way. Worthlessness is healed when you understand you are not becoming valuable. You are recognizing the value you have always possessed. You are not earning worth through performance. You are discovering worth through relationship. If you are someone who struggles with shame-based worthlessness, please understand that your sensitivity to criticism is not a character flaw. It is most often a trauma response. Your need for approval is not spiritual immaturity. It is usually evidence of early wounds that taught you that love was conditional. You don't need to become less sensitive. You need to understand why you are sensitive and heal the wounds that make criticism feel like an attack on your fundamental worth. Father God, I thank you for the healing that set me free from decades of shame-based worthlessness and showed me the profound difference between my actual value and my perceived value. For every single person listening to this who struggles with feeling fundamentally flawed, I pray that they would receive the same liberating freedom that transformed my shame into security. For those who interpret criticism as character attacks rather than performance feedback, help them understand the critical difference between trauma interpretation and truth-based perception. For those who desperately seek human approval to feel valuable, help them discover the unshakable worth that was established before they were born and can never be diminished by human opinion. For those who carry deep shame about being too sensitive to criticism, help them understand that this sensitivity often comes from unhealed wounds that deserve compassion, not condemnation. Help all of us to understand that our worth is not something we earn through performance, but something we receive through our relationship with you. Help us to know, deep in our bones, that we are not trying to become valuable. We are simply learning to recognize the infinite value we have always possessed. Thank you for loving us, not because we are worthy, but because love is who you are. Thank you for showing us that worthlessness is a lie about our perception, not a truth about our value. Protect those who are vulnerable to shame-based thinking, and raise up more people who can teach the difference between worth and worthiness, between trauma and truth. In Jesus' name, Amen. The truth I learned in that Atlanta hotel bathroom is the truth that can set anyone free from the prison of shame-based worthlessness and trauma interpretation. Your worth was established before you were born, and it cannot be diminished by human criticism. You are not fundamentally flawed, overly sensitive, or spiritually immature. You are infinitely valuable, completely loved, and worthy of healing from the wounds that make criticism feel like an attack on your very character. You don't need to earn your value through performance. You don't need universal approval to be acceptable. You don't need to become less sensitive. You need to understand why you're sensitive and heal the wounds that created that sensitivity. Freedom from worthlessness is possible. Healing from shame-based perception is available. Security and divine love is yours for the receiving. Thank you for letting me share the most liberating discovery about human worth I've ever received. I love you all, and Jesus loves you enough to heal every single wound that makes you feel one iota less valuable than you actually are.